Good morning, everyone. You have the agenda. One of the first item we have on here is to elect a chair. Is anyone, any volunteers, or how do you want to go about that?
First person is here, should be the first person, so I'll nominate Thomas.
I second that.
I feel the love. Let the record show I feel the love.
Is everybody in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
How you interpret that.
Okay. So I guess that being said, I know we've got the agenda of looking at the Riverfront Development Plan, procedure for the sale of properties, economic development incentives, discussion for future meetings. Just maybe if we can take a step back, because I know, so I actually watched the minutes of the CD committee and then watched the commission meeting and tried to kind of make sense of the charge of this ad hoc committee. And so maybe before we get into what we should or could do, just can we go around the room, and I'm happy to start if you want, or I can end it. What do we think we are charged with here and for how long? And so I don't know.
Well, I'll start off. I think we're really tasked with trying to find out innovative or needs for affordable housing for the Fargo area. Not only just, I think we should almost separate that into two different categories. The one with regular, LIHTC 60%, the low subsidy ones, and the deep subsidy housing. I think the housing study that we got a review here in our last meeting was showing the how short we are in those different areas, and we're direly short on the deep subsidy housing. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to, that's the one we have to get imaginative about how we're going to fund these things, because there's a lack of federal subsidies or state subsidies to really bring those income limits down to that 30% or lower. Pass it down.
Sam?
Based on also watching and rewatching and rereading all of the various commission meetings and committee meetings, I originally would say to share something from the community development perspective in regards to these RFPs, and separately build the infrastructure, the policies, processes, bylaws, et cetera, for the committee. However, after getting today's packet yesterday, the TIF district packet is what I personally was looking for all the answers to guide the first three RFPs of the Riverfront project. And so I think that inherently that has resolved our role, resolved the understanding of the CDC's role in the first three RFPs, and would love for us to still work and focus on making Community Development Committee a formal structure with responsibilities, boundaries, so we know what our sandbox is. And on that note, I would like our work to be housing, of course, but the broader picture of what community means, and advocating for that, because we've got the people side of it too. A city is more than streets and buildings, and that's a community, and what can we advocate for in that regard? So does that answer?
Yes. It's so weird. I think, honestly, I will save comments, and so I want to make sure Jennifer too. And I just, unless you're like no comment, that's fine. But I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to weigh in on what they thought the charge of the committee was, and just maybe some thoughts on how we guide this work moving forward.
Thank you. I would just add on to that. I concur with everything that both of you had shared, and so I won't repeat because of some of my notes here. But part of the discussion at our last meeting was really how do these RFPs or how do these plans fit into the long-term plan? So not only short-term, but long-term goal of the city and development.
So I will add that I agree with some of the items that were stated. My understanding of our charge is to identify the priorities that we'd like the other committees and council to weigh these projects against, and that does require us to look long-term and holistically at the city. As a newer member of the Community Development Committee, I would also like us to spend some time in this committee to identify where our role and our scope is. I understand we are heavily focused on housing because of HUD and CBDG and the federal programs, but like we said, the city's more than buildings and streets. And so where does our scope of work and influence stop? And where does economic development start? Where does ours stop? Where does the downtown commission start? Where does ours stop and where does Renaissance Zone? Because there are those areas of overlap. And so I'd like to identify for future projects, as they go through the consideration phase, what are we tasked with judging? Where are areas of complementary consideration with other committees and boards? And where does our scope stop? So those clear boundaries, we have curbs and gutters, and as we have such a great opportunity along the riverfront, this is going to come up again. So how do we clarify that process, roles, responsibilities, matrices, priorities, kind of nail that down so that are we a housing committee or are we a community development committee, and what are the areas that we've been neglecting?
All points very well made, and I think my comments and thoughts really align with really what's been said at this table. I think there's a great opportunity to try and look long-term at what and how we operationalize dollars and ensure that this committee from a community-based perspective has voice when appropriate. I just think I want to make sure that we can at least, at this point, as an ad hoc committee, I would like to maybe either have a discussion or make a recommendation that there is proposals for the sale of the 419 3rd Street, in addition to the other sale of the property. I don't know that this committee at this time could make in any sort of timely frame a positive recommendation. And I think, again, for lack of a better term, that ship has already sailed, right? In that, I believe, if I interpreted it correctly, that the city commission voted for the sale to Epic for the 2nd Street building, and then is looking, again, at, based on the review already by EDIC, and then was it the Renaissance zoning, Mr. Gilmore? But those recommendations have already been made. And so I don't know that it's going to do a lot of good. And as I said at that meeting too, I sincerely worry that we are impeding unnecessarily tens, if not more, millions of dollars in potential development with real dollars that are on the line. And so I guess I heard everyone say, but I just want to make sure that it would be clear. Can we agree that this ad hoc committee, or maybe this would be my motion, as an ad hoc committee, is that we wouldn't actually look at the sales or adding a CD input on these proposals as they stand right now? Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or?
No, I think you're kind of spot on there. I think the charge we're looking at is developing a philosophical idea of how we're able to help fund these projects and provide a wide range of housing. I don't think it's within our scope or intent of this to actually drill down and give a yay or nay on any individual project. But I think we just have to evaluate the benefits to the community and how we can best leverage all our resources to develop what's seen as shortcomings.
Jennifer? Yeah.
Thank you. I would just add, so when you look on the city's website for a definition of what this committee is supposed to be, it says, or what the original intent maybe would be better wording, makes recommendations to the city commission regarding land development, economic incentives and grant funds, three main focuses are affordable housing, downtown development, and neighborhood development. So I just thought maybe that would sort of help guide us in this conversation.
I think it absolutely does, given though that we, as a committee or even as a subcommittee, really haven't had the time to do our, I would say due diligence on these proposals, and that I don't know what the rubric is. And again, we've seen now in the TIF district and even with like some of the edict stuff that how they would like to score proposals. But again, I don't know that I would feel very comfortable. Actually, I can say that very, very forcefully. I would not feel comfortable making a formal recommendation to Commissioner Strand on the commission to say we should pick this one over this one. And again, I think that would also do a disservice to the committees that have already done their due diligence and the work that's in front of the commission potentially in the next coming weeks. And so I think, Jennifer, that's a great thing to come back and look at as we think about what everyone said is, what is the mission, the vision, and then the bylaws and the scope that this committee, as the CD committee, should really entail. But I just want to make sure that as the commission gets back together at their next regularly scheduled meeting and Commissioner Strand is like, hey, what did you guys recommend? Our recommendation is that whatever's already been recommended is what's going to go forward, but that this committee isn't going to weigh in formally to say, you should choose this one or send it back to multiple subcommittees for future or for further review or vetting. Sam.
So on your note specifically about the RFPs, setting aside the future of the CDC, in regards to our role in the three RFPs, I agree that there is no clear need for CDC because of, again, the TIF development document that explains on page 4 under the 2021 activities that says that money for this is to go back into Riverfront renewal area, basically, to sum up those 4 bullet points. Various activities, but that it will fund other activities in the renewal area. And that clarifies what I have been trying to figure out for 3 weeks about the CDC's role in these particular RFPs. So I agree that we do not have a role as the CDC in the 3 RFPs on the table, and then separate conversation for the future of the CDC.
Can I ask Mr. Mayor, you have your hand up.
Hi. I'm glad you guys are struggling this morning because that sometimes happens. I just want to go back to the history of the Community Development Committee, which we used to get grants from the federal government, community grants. And this committee, what they would do is take the federal grants and decide where it went, whether it's storefront, whether it was different things. I think what we're trying to get at is more of what we want in the community. Riverfront development, do we want to do in Northside? If you take a house down, do you replace it with apartment? Now the neighborhood may say no, you guys may say, no, this is really what's going on in the world. This is how we should do things. We have development in South 52nd and South. Do we put walking paths in? Do we put bike paths in? What is your sense of what does the world want as we go forward? I see it as a great opportunity for you to give us direction of, hey, this is where we think if we're going to build a beautiful city and landlocked right by the diversion, how do we best want to do our future development? And Sam, to your point, yeah, with the TIFs and pilots, what Jim has set up, we can fund low-income housing, and that's where we get the money. For the first 3 projects, you might take best and most money that you can get so you can put it back in the TIF and do things. I've got a plaza out here. I get a bridge, pedestrian bridge over to the river. What am I going to do with the plaza? I see a lot of dogs out there, but I think I also want a lot of people out there. So should we make an attempt to have, like New York City, a big park in front or grass in front? Or what do you guys think? So I think it's a greater opportunity for you to look at the global. Here are our recommendations for Fargo and what happens. Now, artist flats cannot fill their apartments, low-income housing. They're not full. They could have built a second building. Why did that fail? Why didn't we go ahead with that? And you guys know the needs of low-income housing. Chris, you know where that sits. So it's kind of a going forward, the city will approve 100 apartments, but will approve as well 50 low-income apartments, or I mean, some of those. it's more of the global view, I think, is what we need help on the commission. What do you guys think? If we're going to build the biggest and brightest and greatest city, where should we head? And I always thought initially if we did density, North Fargo would be real happy. You take out 3 houses and you put in an apartment building, wouldn't that be great? And we have many of them that done that. But the neighborhood comes marching and says, hey, we don't want to do that. We have $1 million that are set aside for north side development to what you want to do. This is a great place for you guys to intersect and, hey, I think we should maybe think about this or think about that. So I'm just trying to clarify. So historically, Community Development Committee kind of, it's been sitting out there quiescent for quite some time. But now is the time really to have a voice of, here's our recommendations going forward, what the city of Fargo should strongly consider. And I don't mean to overreach on this, Tom, but I think that's kind of what we need from you, because I can have my ideas and planning can have his ideas. What if planning's wrong? What if planning is running the wrong direction from your recommendations? And I think that's where it can be really helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would absolutely agree. I think, I just wanted to make sure we could at least address what I think, again, I believe I heard in, Commissioner Strand asking for this committee to do some work on these proposals. And at least from consensus, again, I'm pretty terrible at Robert's Rules of Order, but from consensus, we are in agreement that we are not going to bring forward any recommendations, and that hopefully at the next commission meeting, you guys can say, nope, the ad hoc committee said we're not going to put forward any recommendations. What we want to look at is that global vision, and then how is this committee structured and how do we actually do our work so we feel prepared, so we understand what we can do, what our limits of authority are. And even to your example, Mr. Mayor, that if there's $1 million in development for North Fargo, we should know about that. And I mean, admittedly, I didn't. And I'm not throwing shade at anyone for that. I'm just saying those are things I think that our committee should be talking about very strategically versus, oh, hey, there's going to be a new potential development on 419 3rd Street. Oh, really? Oh, okay. And again, maybe egg on our face for not knowing that, but I also think then that's how this committee is structured as the CD committee. Is it a governance model that advises or tries to, again, from a global perspective, advise the city planning department, or are we more of an operational committee that is tasked with actually doing things? And that, to me, again, we have different levels of interest and levels of participation at different times. And so I think those kinds of clarifying things would really help the commission and ultimately the city planning department as they go out and actually do their work on a 40-plus hour a week basis. So, all right.
So do you need a motion to,
I'm looking at the city
The
folks. Do you guys need a formal motion that we are not going to move forward on making a recommendation on any of the downtown proposals? Okay. So I would entertain a motion. Absolutely.
May I ask you a question before you do that? Is that okay?
course.
So thank you, Mayor, for that. I found that to be extremely helpful around the history of this committee and our intent, help us define that. When I hear and think about global or weighing in on these particular proposals, to me, it seems what the committee was asked to do maybe in the past, maybe it'll be different moving forward depending on the discussion and where it goes, but is not necessarily on the, yes, this project, this RFP, we also would make the recommendation for. I see it based on that definition as really, do we as a committee see what the planning or the commission have said, yes, we're going to go ahead with? Do we see it fitting into that sort of global plan or that long-term or that what we've already decided as a city to make happen in certain areas, right? And then to add on to that, much like the $1 million example up north, how does the community feel about it? So I kind of see it as, multiple, obviously, areas, but I don't see, so when we say we're not going to make a recommendation, I guess my question really is, if we're going to do that, are we really saying we're not going to weigh in on any developments then? So that's what I want us to think about before we make that motion.
that's a good point.
So I would, to address that, because I do feel that we may have a say in future developments. So I would make a motion that we defer an opinion. We will defer to the judgment of other commissions and boards who have already weighed on the specific RFPs that are currently in existence, with the understanding that these discussions will help solidify and clarify our role and consideration in future RFPs.
I would second that motion. Any further discussion on this? All right, so there is a motion that we would defer an opinion on these specific proposals right now, deferring to the recommendations that already come forward from the city, with the understanding that we are building out a process to have future input on proposals that would help align with community development, housing, neighborhoods, all the points that were made. So there's a motion on a second on the table for that. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Post same sign. Okay. Is that what you guys need? Well, at this point, an official. Jim? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I won't get into the weeds on kind of these proposals now, but I think there is a role for the Community Development Committee on a couple of future redevelopment sites. And if you looked at how we did the proposal, and I won't get into the details, but, those proposals were based on a plan already in place and we're fairly far down the road. I think there are other cases where we're really just at the beginning. The one is the Burrell site that the Housing Authority owns. That's currently low-income housing, 100-year-old building. At some point, it's going to need to be redeveloped. And I think this committee could, provide some thoughts in, okay, what, housing market are we targeting with that site, as well as the Riverfront plan looked at that site south of Prairie St. John's, where there's vacant property that may be available for housing. And I think that fits real well with the scope of this committee. The other map I just passed out is that of water tower sites, and the city's in the process of building a big new water tower near 7th Avenue and University, be 2.5 million gallons. With that, they will take down 3 other water towers. So, those will be 3 surplus property sites. The new water tower won't be up until the end of 2023. Presumably, it'll take another year to get that other site down, but it's probably never too early to be looking at those sites and saying, what should be there? How does it fit with the core neighborhood plan? How does it fit with some of our housing needs? So, I think this might be a very good role for the Community Development Committee to be engaged in the process early on, before we declare it surplus property, before we put together criteria, before we decide what the needs are. So as we get that housing study back, these are some sites to kind of keep in mind and sort of get in here early to start to think about what's the best long-term use for these sites. So I think, these properties combined with the 2 Riverfront properties, combined with, we have a vacant building at 69 4th Street. You've been involved some with the CDBG and home budgeting, I believe. And so how can we, put that together? The Economic Development Incentives Committee and our policies they are supportive of affordable housing with property tax exemptions. And so, but I think that committee too often just defers the type of project more to, the Housing Authority and the Community Development Department. They've just generally been supportive of realizing we need to provide property tax incentives if we're going to have these projects be feasible. So those are some of my thoughts for what you might want to look at in the future. I'd just be happy to answer any questions.
Go.
Thank you, Jim. So my questions are, as you're visiting about which locations we're going to have to think about, right? It brings me back to sort of the ad hoc's charge in defining how that process goes, and you suggested really having an opportunity or to visit about how do we integrate it then how do we integrate this community along the way through the plans, right? Whether that's in conjunction with the planning committee, we attend those meetings just to stay informed, right? Throughout the process. I don't know what that might look like, but I bring it back to how do we then define the role of this committee and what that's going to look like. So if we're looking at it globally, do these proposed plans fit into that? What are the structured ways to gather the data or the input from the neighborhoods? And how do we determine what model we want to follow? And then also, to something the mayor said, if a project fails, why? So how are we going to measure that? Or how are we going to put input? How do we decide which model we're going to study, right? Or which city that is successful in how they've renovated this, something similar. How are we going to do that? What does that process look like? In my mind, I'm thinking, because we can't answer these questions until we know those answers, right?
Yeah,
Am I on the right
I'd
track
happily give
here?
you my musings and my thoughts, but I don't know that they're worth, the ink that I'd print them on, so,
Right?
yeah.
And we can all have our opinions, maybe what goes there, or our groups of folks, but how do we reach further into the community to get that larger sense? I think I also heard that was kind of, our charge here. And so to me, I'm just structured, like, how are we going to do that?
I think one important thing that's going to be on that's on the horizon is the results of that housing study. I think right now we all have our own assumptions about what the need are, but we don't have any real good data. And so I think when you have that way you can better address how do we, solve for those problems. These particular sites, they're all unique sites. One's in the middle of a single-family neighborhood, so it's a matter of looking at the core neighborhood plan and saying, site by site, what fits in. One's more in the edge of the downtown, one's kind of halfway in between. And so looking at those already adopted plans and saying, okay, what's the best use for this property that'll fit with our plans and the surrounding area. And then when we go out and sell the property, we can say, we think this site, we only want to look at proposals that are low-density housing or mixed use, or we're wide open. And so then our selection criteria fit what our goals are.
Sam, you had a thought?
I am not trying to flex any muscle, but I want to share as in this group the longest standing committee member because I've seen it transition through a few different things. Even before my time, like 8 years ago, it was created to address, part of why it was created was some HUD requirements about community input, but also a social services fund, a small pot of money to be a part of the city's connection with the community via nonprofit and community work. And it was a really nice way to have some weight. And sometimes you can scream as loud as you want, but until the money talks, it's hard to make a point about something. And so that was a really cool tool where we could say what we wanted to see in the community with some funding. And that has changed where that money sits and how that goes into a different process. And also in the most recent phase, this kind of phase 2, we've shifted, we were doing that, but also, storefront and what were the other things? Storefront money and a couple of other really specific,
Blight? Was it Blight?
Blight, yeah, a couple of specific programs where either that program no longer exists or, we accomplish the goals we set out to with that funding for whatever reason. And so I think it all comes to a head right now, like it all is just timing out where this is also the next phase for community development as those programs have changed for good. for good, like permanently and for the better. And now we're in a really great time to do that. And thank you, Jim, for bringing this, because sometimes it's easier to build the how do we do this if we have an example to say, okay, now what does that look like with this thing in front of us? And so we can do the tedious work of, okay, now this is how we're going to make this decision, and here's our example of like, okay, when we apply it realistically, what does that look like? And I think I've read this EDIC policies and guidelines many times, and it's really beautiful. And I think that there's a lot of the process that got to this will serve the CDC as well, and so would love to have insight from the staff and the folks that made this happen. I think there's some other layers that CDC needs to add to this just by the nature of the work, but I think this is a really great example of what a committee can use as policies and guidelines.
Well, that was going to be my question, if I could ask city staff, when there's no doubt, I would guess, other examples of community development committees in other cities and other states. Would it be possible, or is it feasible to develop or take some recommendations from staff on what this might look like if it was for the Community Development Committee? So we don't have to create something from scratch.
I might end up answering this in a roundabout way.
Go ahead, we got till 1.
The different committees and commissions within the city that, you know, seem to stay on task and achieve great things, have a decent set of bylaws and understandings of what the rules are. It seems like this committee is struggling with maybe what the future looks like, and maybe I would recommend we start looking at some sort of a process of talking about the bylaws, talking about what the mission is going to be, working with the commissioners on getting that direction, which is, it's going to be a 6-month to a year process of doing that. And that might help define a little bit more of the Community Development Committee's role, because that's been one commission that has never had bylaws implemented either.
Well, that was going to be my next question of, are there existing bylaws or any sort of mission, vision, I mean, even, again, authority to what they can actually, again, we as a committee can actually recommend. Again, if those don't exist, then yes, I think that should be our first charge to look at. How do we get those codified into a process that allows this to live on long after, maybe Samuel still be on here, but as the longest standing committee member is my lame attempt at humor. So, but long after all of us are gone. So that would be, I think, my ask of this group is to, how do we work on that? So then as proposals like this, we can visually see them, but then understand, okay, what is our charge? Knowing that housing, a little bit of a dirt road, but Jennifer, I think about what schools are located right around here. So do we want more housing, or do we want an amenity? Do we want to leave it as green space? Do you want it to be something else? But we could come back and say, okay, what are the things we think are important as a committee, and say, okay, no, we've got a housing project already down here, so that's great, or no, we don't, so we need this. And the third and final piece of all this is the transportation. And so if we're going to make more of these things available, how do we make sure people can access them? So back, yes, I know roundabout ways, but so no bylaws currently exist for a CD committee?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, we probably need to get to work on that.
I'd have to dig in our old records back when we created the committee. I was in the planning department then, and I'm not sure. I mean, there was really a broad mission, but this was created in the late 1990s. That was before we had the Renaissance Zone Authority, and so as that group came in, they kind of grabbed hold of the downtown redevelopment and kind of took that, and this committee didn't have to address that. We had a tax exempt review committee that dealt almost exclusively with primary sector jobs. They've now kind of expanded their role into brownfield and some of the things you've done. So I think it is good to work with the planning and development department and say, okay, where is there a gap in committees, because this committee isn't really working on neighborhood redevelopment. They're, they're supportive of low-income housing with policies, but they're not trying to take the lead on that. And so I think there's some areas, with the new core neighborhood plan, where you could play a role, and as well as continue to work with the HUD money. And so I think it's important to go back and look at that. And if, maybe you don't need to worry about the downtown because we already have a group working on that. And we used to use CDBG money, have a set aside for downtown projects, and that's not there anymore because, with the storefront rehab, we've been very successful and there's not a lot of blight left on Broadway. So I think working with planning to try to redefine the role would be very important, for the whole committee.
Is that a feasible ask to make of the staff to try and
I'll defer
give
to
us a
Mark.
little direction? So, yeah, I'm looking over at the staff. Is that feasible to give us some direction? Again, knowing that we're volunteers and that I don't want to put together bylaws and a bunch of stuff that you're like, Because again, I believe, and this is Thomas Hill's opinion, but I believe our job is to aid, to help, and maybe to set some, even in essence, some limitations or some guiding principles out, not to dictate how you guys do your jobs. You're professional staff that have been doing this for decades. And so I just want to make sure that we respect and help, not hinder this process.
I was just going to add, Thomas, thank you for the remarks, and thanks for the committee for your discussion today. I just want to support what Mark said. I think that we can absolutely look at, introspectively, kind of look at why we do what we do and how to make some improvements for the future. We're absolutely open to that. We can help assist with that and make sure that we are delivering a return on investment of time for the committee volunteer as well. Because I think that every opportunity that we have to engage the public and have committee members is an opportunity for us to also ask that question: how do we make sure that this is a valuable investment of time on their part so that they feel that they're contributing and trying to move the ball, move the needle as well. So we're absolutely happy to help with that. I think that we can assist, but I appreciate your discussion today. I think there was some good dialogue, and you're correct, and Jennifer noted this, really the only thing we have on record is what was on the website as well as what has been identified in your documents. That really is the history, and as Jim said, there's kind of a more interesting history from the 1990s of kind of some of the housing policy decisions this committee previously had, but I think that we can absolutely orient this to the future. So I'll just leave it at that, but thank you for your time today.
Jennifer, sorry.
Thank you. Great points, and I'm so glad that you brought up schools, because I could give you examples of where, in terms of identifying opportunities to bring which voices to the table, right, when we talk about development, where there was a rezoning a number of years ago out by the old Kmart area, and the schools found out about it by getting 50 more kiddos than they had projected over at Lincoln, and then we didn't have room for 50 extra children, so we had to bring in mobile units, right? And so that's a perfect example of where I would suggest or see an opportunity to for this community, or for the Community Development Committee, to make sure that those voices were brought together somewhere in this process of developing areas and neighborhoods, that things like schools, they're also sitting at the table throughout the process, and it's not like an afterthought sort of thing. How can we coordinate that together? And then Jim, you mentioned funding, and I hear Sam share the history, thank you, Sam, about HUD and sort of where that all began. And I think of, okay, how are there sources of funding coming in that the city has access to that could be also used in partnership, right? Because like you said, a developer isn't going to come in and build necessarily this low-income housing that's not profitable. I think, the example that you were giving, how can we partner with them to like, what unique ways? Are there other cities that have models? And that leads me to my last point, which is around what we saw in the packet, what other developers are doing and using, and what's driving them to those examples. It's sort of looking at the same way, right? What are other cities, or how are they structuring this opportunity in terms of whether it's called community development or something different, but what does that look like? Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's an opportunity to try and, maybe not in every single instance, but if there are CDBG dollars or home funds, or if there are the American Rescue Plan dollars, how do we leverage those for development when appropriate? And I just don't know that we as a committee are seeing the full picture. And I think that's maybe, even just generally or broadly speaking, some of the maybe concern or frustration I heard at the last CD meeting was just that we get brought proposals that, again, on their face, they all seem really good. And then I think as each one of us probably dug into them, then it's like, oh, well, maybe not that. Well, maybe not that. Maybe we shouldn't have even have considered this proposal. And so we just, I think moving forward, we want to have a voice in, and again, when appropriate, in these proposals to ensure that we're not just building row houses or we're expanding suburbia, but that we're really thinking thoughtfully about how to design neighborhoods for residents of all income levels. So, Sam.
Yes, and I support the move to the structure that bylaws, the things that we need to have in place to have whatever boundaries and authority, whatever our scope is, so that the pieces are in place to do that logistically. And I think what we're all driving at is that and we keep coming back to, we've got the core neighborhood plan, we've got these different plans in place and really incredible studies. The city has made incredible, very smart investments to hire folks with the skills and expertise to do those studies and those plans. And we always refer back to plans of, well, that's in the plan, but every plan needs an advocate, right? We've seen many a strategic plan sit on the shelf because no one is advocating for the pieces of it. And so I see that as, we don't need to make a lot of decisions about, what do we think should happen here and here and here. There's expert recommendations on those. I think that understanding how hard we can advocate and where to advocate that will be a really great opportunity for this committee. And what I see working otherwise, on the CDC, we've got a held seat, for example, the chair of the Planning Commission. And so over and over, they have shared what's going on with, or a perspective or experience from the Planning Commission that answers a question for us. And so how can we also play in the sandbox with those other commissions to provide and advocate for those pieces of the plan that we're talking about, as opposed to operating in isolation and nobody really knows, if we should be invited to their table or not. Because even Economic Development Incentives Committee saying we're pro affordable housing, those kinds of things. And if we share a plan that says, affordable housing in this spot, and we're like, no. And they're like, but it's affordable housing. And then, if we have a seat at their table to say, that's not what this specific area needs, refer back to the community, or refer back to the core neighborhood plan, whatever that is. Sometimes it just needs a microphone at the table. Thanks for listening to my talk.
Chris, thoughts that you may have from the housing perspective as we have this conversation? Want to make sure we have people obviously weigh in, and because I think we're, in essence, and I offered you the microphone and then won't shut up, so I apologize, but we're in essence in agreement, at least what I hear, and I want to again make sure if people do not agree that they can voice their opinion. But then I think it's coming down to then what is the next steps of how we actually operationalize some of that. But before maybe we get into that, I want to make sure, Chris, if you have further comments, that we address them from the housing perspective as well.
In the housing perspective, I think the mayor was relating back to artist lofts that were having a problem filling their units. And I think we start looking from a philosophical standpoint that we talk affordable housing and no one really knows what affordable housing is. What's the criteria that goes in there? Well, all these different low-income tax credit housing plans will come up as they're geared at 80% to the area median income. Well, 60%, sorry. 60% is quite a high number when it comes to the Fargo-Moorhead area. I mean, if you're talking, we're talking $40,000, $50,000 for annual income. In my mind, when we're talking about getting affordable housing, I don't think a lot of times that's the target audience that we're looking at. So when we start looking at some of these developments that have been proposed, they're saying low income, we're looking at 60% AMI. And I think the issue is when we're still getting more down to the 30 and the 40% AMI, and those people can't really afford to live in these 60% units. So how do we make up that difference? And that's what I think we really need to strive at, is how we get some of those more deeper subsidies, or find some way to have mixed housing developments. You know, can we, if there's a new development of 100 units, can we provide subsidies or some manner for them to get 10% of those units, 10 units into a lower income bracket than the 60%? I mean, there might be some funding issues. I mean, for LIHTC funding, they have 50% level and they have 60% level, but it doesn't say you can set them for lower. You're okay setting it lower, just can't go higher. And I think those are type of things we have to take a look at, is we talk and we have some ideas, but we need to define exactly what level we want to get down to.
It's a point well made. And moving off of that, not off of that, but I guess in addition to that, I think one of the things that I maybe have just learned recently, and especially in talking with some of the people who are proposing to develop the plats, I don't know if that was me, but apologies, that these things aren't easy. And again, maybe that should be like really common sense to developers, but as a community member who doesn't build affordable housing or housing in general, again, all this is, it's kind of interesting. And you think about all of the different things, and the gentleman from Kilbourne Group who was talking about having to do core soil samples already. And so how do we, or do we as a committee need to have any sort of process or help develop and shepherd relationships with developers so they know that there's an opportunity to build maybe a mixed use project that part of it's for 30% AMI and the rest of it might be for market rate, or, you know, so that stuff doesn't just drop out of the sky. And so, and I know that's a hard thing to do, but I think it's really important that if we are going to move forward with having more of a, not a master plan, but just thinking about neighborhood development in a mixed use way, we have to be developing relationships with developers, not only locally, but regionally and nationally, so they understand what the mission, and I think like we need to make sure that this committee has a microphone so we can help incentivize developers or say, hey, this would be on the table, this would be on the table, we would encourage you to apply. Because again, and again, this is Thomas Hill talking, I think the proposal, and again, I know those are off the table, but that proposal from Authentic Housing is very interesting because it talks about passive housing and a bunch of great opportunities, but as to their own pro forma and even just answers, it's yet unproven. And I don't believe as a development group, they have done one project. And so I don't know that that's the way that we want to say, hey, let's make this happen. Now, maybe in 5 years, they are the developer, or maybe it's 2, I don't know, or 10. But we need to have a process and to make sure that we can talk about what we want to see and the types of projects we want to see so developers can get that on their radar and actually develop a competitive bid and proposal to develop something like that in our community.
You know, Thomas, you just made me want to fly off on a tangent on that one. I mean, when you're bringing in authentic housing, I think a lot of the ideas they had in there were very novel to attempt to make housing more sustainable as we move into the future. And I did have opportunity to look at their pro forma, and I think they might be overreaching in some areas. But I think, you know, part of our charge, I think we should take a look at some of those ideas of sustainability. Transportation, I think some of these things ring back in around again. Transportation infrastructure, existing infrastructure. So if we could infill and increase some density and still be able to use those underground pipes down there, make sure we don't use up all the capacity in the local areas, I think that might be I might get too far in the weeds, but.
I think your idea of talking with some of the local developers who've done affordable housing would be important to kind of hear what kind of resources they need. Enclave has done some affordable housing projects in Minnesota, but there are more resources there that we don't have in North Dakota. Lloyd Companies, who is proposed to be up here there, I'm told one of the largest affordable housing developers in South Dakota, and also into Iowa, but they have a lot more resources. So, what are other states putting in that we don't have? And is there a way to, to bring those kind of resources either in from the state or locally? Because I've just seen developers put together an affordable housing project with the 4.5% credits, and they get close, and then they say, no, it just doesn't work. We're just short of money. It's going to cost too much, and they drop the project. And so, getting close doesn't get us anything, but if there's a way to make something feasible, then let's see where we're short and determine if we can fill that gap. Maybe we can, maybe we can't.
Taking a step back, I think this conversation about a compelling development with amenities that we haven't seen before, I mean, that's really the crux of the issue. At any point, the next RFP, a developer is going to come with something new and shiny that we haven't considered as a community, and we're going to say, oh, that. So I really do think that's the benefit of this community is taking, or this committee is taking that step back, and with a thoughtful, intentional process, like to project manage what we're tasked with and what it's going to take for us on the front end, where we are having this philosophical discussion about roles and scopes and all that. And at the end, having a crystal clear picture of our bylaws, our mission, how we fit within the greater context of other boards and commissions, and how we integrate into policy, and we've identified our priorities. I really think that is the crux of our issue, is that there's always going to be something new and shiny. There's always going to be a really cool drawing. But we need to understand, okay, so who is looking at the financial pro formas? Is that staff? Is that economic development? Is that incentives? Who's looking at the schools? Is that in our wheelhouse? I really think that that's the crux of the issue. And so what I would like, as a committee member, trying to close the gap of where we are versus where we need to be, hopefully at the end of this process, I would love to see a meeting where we discuss or we learn from staff the historical context of this committee. So what reiterations, what phases have we gone through? What have we been tasked with in the past? So we understand what we were originally created for. I'd love to understand and receive the bylaws of the other committees and commissions that we interface with, so we can understand what they have been tasked with, so we're not overstepping our curb and gutter. That'll also, I think, help solidify and let us identify where those gaps are. I would love to see then from there, with that context and historical knowledge, we will be armed with taking a look at bylaws of other cities and communities and start drafting our own. From there, we can look at those models of who are we looking to emulate, what are best practices, we incorporate that in the bylaw drafting. And then we can look at what are the existing plans, where's the Riverfront plan? Like Sam said, what work has already been done, what expert opinions do we already have, and understand what resources we have that we pull on. And then we can talk about what are our priorities and where we fit in the process. I really think, like, just trying to project manage, how do we get there? Those, I feel like, are the context pieces that I would be missing as a committee member, and that's where I think that we can really interface with staff to say, here's what we're looking for, here's what we need to make an informed decision and have a thoughtful, intentional discussion.
I stopped taking notes because I was listening very intently, and I'm like, no, go, stop. So can you, that is awesome, because I think that honestly is a brilliant way to move forward, and exactly that. We should be able to listen to staff, as I'm sure they're about 25, if not more, steps ahead of us already, again, knowing that that's what they do on a full-time basis. And so where we can add value and really give this committee some direction is exactly what you just said, Cindy. So I think that's honestly a perfect way to move forward. And I know we are probably disgustingly off the agenda, but I want to make sure that, I think that's, as we talk about, discussion of future meetings, we should probably figure out what do we need to do between now and the next meeting to make sure that we are ready for that. And so I would be open to ideas on when and what we should try and do in the interim between now and the next meeting, so we can actually move forward with what Cindy's talking about, because I like that a lot, personally. Sam? Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, all the things. So for what we do in the interim, I think my first question is, what kind of timeline can we reasonably expect, whatever that is, from staff to have prepared for our next meeting, I guess would be the first, because if it's a long while, then I think some of us can do some of that work too. If they're like, oh, we've got these drafts sitting in a file, we're ready to go, then, that changes the timeline too.
Maybe we ask, Mark, I mean, you said 6 months to a year, I believe, as we kind of talked about this, but I just want to make sure, what do you think is a reasonable timeline?
That's a good question. I think a couple weeks ago, Nicole just presented what our, work plan was, and I don't recall this was in our work plan for this year. So it gets to be really challenging to be able to juggle the other stuff that's on our plate and then start focusing immediately on this. So I think that might be a process of just sitting down and talking about where we go from here versus making a decision right now on, okay, next, in April 1st, we're going to have this. And I don't know if that's reasonable to the group either, but I think we need to look at all aspects of it. And, kind of to add to some of the discussion, we have several plans, the In-Focus plan, the Core Neighborhood plan, we have our growth plan, and we're constantly modifying those and trying to get them updated. And those plans provide outlines that really point to the direction of which way the city wants to go when people come to the city and do developing. And, when it comes to our CDBG money, we get about 1.2 million every year, which it's hard to do big projects with that type of money. But in addition, those plans have a 5-year consolidated plan, and then they have an annual action plan. So every time those ideas or directions change, we need to go back and change those action plans and those consolidated plans. And there are certain aspects with the Planning Commission that are required by law based on the state as far as what some of their roles are. And maybe it'd be a good start to be able to understand what are all the other commissions do, and technically what legally are they responsible for. And so there's not overlap there either.
Could we maybe at least get a look at, and again, I could probably find this as well, but like the bylaws of other subcommittees, so maybe we could model some bylaws off of that, or some committee structure, just to, again, keep in consistency. So if I think about like the edict, like is there some, outside of this, which again is quite comprehensive, but are there, like, can we just model that so we're at least in line and we're not coming up with something brand new?
We certainly could look at that. I'm trying to think which ones have bylaws and which ones don't. I do know the Planning Commission has bylaws.
Sure.
I'm not sure about the rest of them.
Okay. Yeah, Jennifer.
Thank you. So I was trying to take notes too. They were, so I'm not
You
certain
gotta-
that I
you
got it
gotta
all. You
email
might
that
have
out
to
to everybody,
fill
yeah.
in the blanks here for me. But so as I listened to, discussion around obviously the work plan and the questions that we want answered here as a committee, my question to Jim really is, you mentioned Sioux Falls. Has the city already identified throughout this process a model that they like? I get that there's, riverfront development plans and all of this that is on our agenda, and I'm just thinking of ways, how can we get this accomplished based on, the agreed upon goals that we just talked about, without having to wait for, a presentation, so we don't delay the process. And so do these things currently fit within the city? And, are there gaps is where I see sort of the questions coming up, arising here, like wanting this committee to take a look at those specifically in front of us, right? And to help sort of try to seed it from a global standpoint. So can we do that today? Do we put that, how do you guys see that, us working through that prior to being able to establish our bylaws and all of that? Because they're here right now. Maybe so if Sioux Falls is the model, do we know that, or is it just?
I just mentioned that because there's other states where we've seen probably more innovative and more widespread use of these 4% tax credits that we have not not seen in North Dakota. I mean, I think in the short term, there was the Riverfront Development Plan that was more to explain, how we got here. But, the couple things on the horizon is really the Burrell site. And of course, the Housing Authority owns that. They've, I don't think they have any immediate plans to redevelop it, but it's going to be something that needs to be addressed. And so this committee providing some input to the Housing Authority might be useful. The property down by Prairie St. John's, we know Beyond Shelter is working on trying to acquire some property there. They have their idea of what type of housing they feel there's a need for. I think that probably aligns with the housing study, so to be aware of that, but you might want to have some input in on that. And so if we, I don't know if those will really be in RFPs, but they're going to need resources from the community development block grant program, the home block grant program, the state, the tax exempt review committee. So you need a lot of resources, and so you can be helpful in supporting that when the proposal comes in.
So I recognize, Jennifer, that absolutely, yeah, we're here today. We've got planning development staff in the room. I'm wondering though and I'm just trying to think about if I look at a timeline, it's March 2nd today, but that would it be okay to give the staff a little bit of time to digest this, and given Mark's points that there's already a work plan that they're already trying to work through, would it be realistic to give them, I don't know, like 60 days to maybe come back with some of those models? That way we're not saying, oh, we're going to go with Sioux Falls, right? And again, I didn't hear you saying, let's go with Sioux Falls, but would it be reasonable to say, give staff a couple months, come back at maybe when do we meet next? The CD committee, is it? We should all know this, I know, but.
Yes, quarterly.
Yeah, okay. May? Thank you, Miranda. We knew that because it's on our calendars. So maybe at the May CD meeting, we could have some presentations on what some models would look like. I'm guessing too that in the interim, if it would be helpful, and again, I mean this as a help, not as a hindrance, if it would be helpful, I'd be willing to just look at some bylaws or some other committee structures and maybe work with city staff as appropriate or as asked to help try and develop some of those. Or maybe this committee could meet once in the interim and just look at a couple models. Maybe we want to bring some different ideas to the table, but that, again, it's with the idea that I feel just very strongly that we do this to aid staff, not to add another burden on them and say, let's go down this road right now. Again, thinking about the HUD plans and the consolidated action plans, those are the caper that TIA does every year. Those are no small feats. And so then to add on this is a lot. And I think about how I interact with my own board and the organization that pays me. I don't know that I would want them saying, you know what you should do tomorrow, right? And I recognize that sometimes that's how it works. But I think maybe if we could do a couple things. One, I would absolutely welcome a presentation from Planning and Development at the next CD committee on potential models and structures for this. So that would give them at least 60 days to think about some things, think through some things. And then I would also entertain if we want to meet one more time and at least just maybe discuss what some bylaws look like, some committee structures, but I would defer, Cindy, to your project management plan there because I think that was pretty darn spot on.
I have opinions, we'll share. In terms of the division of duties between this ad hoc committee and the CD committee as a whole, I would propose that we use the CD committee as a whole to hear those historical contexts. It's basically committee education. That way the full committee gets the benefit of that information. And then we use this subcommittee as the work group so that when we're drafting bylaws and it's actually a working session. So at our May committee, I could see, having a presentation on the historical context of the CD committee. Hopefully that's not too hard of a lift with staff, given that this is just historical information and things that hopefully staff understands and knows. And then we can once we start looking at actual models, we could schedule that as a work session even after our May committee. And so let this first CD committee be the historical context of the CD committee, and maybe even the context and the mission of the other committees that the city has around us, and let that be kind of a context meeting, and then the CD committee as a whole gets the benefit of that education.
I hear, I don't hear, I saw Sam shake her head. Chris? Jennifer? Yeah? Okay. I absolutely concur as well. So I think, does that seem reasonable then to staff to say, so we would get some historical context at the May meeting? And then from there, this committee could be used as a work group to help develop bylaws, again, with city staff, but it would be post-May. So between now and May, all we really want is some historical context, and then maybe to look at that May presentation, how other committees are structured and some opportunities there, then maybe to move forward.
Sounds reasonable.
Excellent. Are there other items? Yeah, Jennifer.
So as I'm thinking about meeting dates, I have to ask, so maybe someone in the room can share the historical perspective on this, but why only once a quarter? It seems like a really big job for once a quarter, right?
I will weigh in just from my perspective. I've been on the committee for about 6-ish years. And again, United Way has had a standing seat on this committee for, I think, about 15 years.
Since the beginning, I think.
Yeah, and so I believe the once a quarter meetings went to not just trying to meet, and I think without maybe a lack of clear direction and community input, it was a lot of staff reports and saying, here's what we're doing. And I don't, some actionable items versus, hey, let's just meet because we have a standing committee meeting, maybe in layman's terms, so.
Yeah, and once those programs that we were talking about earlier ran out, that's where we're kind of at that position right now where it's like, what is the next phase of Community Development Committee? And in that kind of influx base plus staff, doing their jobs plus a pandemic, we said, what can we do to be not a burden? And so in that kind of interim, I think I don't know, but that's what I saw value in moving to quarterly. But absolutely, as we define that, I could see moving to more frequently, again, like we used to.
I think if you looked back at the agendas historically, the committee would meet probably, 3 months in a row as we decided how the money was going to get spent, would listen to different proposals. It generally happened in the fall, and then you get to spring, city commissions approve the budget, and then unless there's a budget change, that monthly meeting wouldn't be held. And so, but I don't know if you're as involved in making those budgetary recommendations anymore. And so perhaps that's why it's kind of quarterly. I get defer to Mark. I haven't been to your meetings for quite some time.
Mark, any?
I would say all of the comments I just heard were correct.
Cool. Let the record show. Yeah. So any further items that we feel at this point that we would like to discuss? Again, I'm completely open to that, so.
Yeah, unless there's anything else, I have a quick question just because we have been on air so much in the last 2 weeks. Have gotten questions from fellow community members about the RFP process, just as a question of how that works for the Riverfront renewal, but also just in general. What is the process for staff and commission, every party involved to get to the, October 5th issuance of this RFP document? Like what are the steps and who decides what to get to this point?
Sure, I'll try to address that. Well, first of all, we'd had the Go 2030 plan, and so that laid this broad vision for the community about encouraging more infill. Then we focused more on a downtown plan. We've had various downtown plans over the years, and then so this particular one was adopted, and it talked about trying to do development along the riverfront. Yet there were no real specifics, and so the Riverfront Development Plan was something that the City Commission directed us to prepare. Basically, it's an implementation plan. So we don't probably do any community input because we already did that. And so we just put together the plan. I get input from sometimes the finance committee, the liaison commissioners to say, okay, well, what are things that we've had in the downtown plan that we haven't, paid for, like redoing Mid-America Steel, that's sort of in the plan, but how are we going to do that? We don't have any money. Build a pedestrian bridge, encourage development along the river, we'll need incentives. So kind of bundle all those things into the plan. And so the first step when the city commission took action was the idea, let's do a detailed plan along the river. And so we also worked with Aaron Nelson in planning. We drafted the plan. We got some initial input from the commission. They approved the plan. And so then now if we see in the plan, well, we're going to do these things each year. We're going to sell these 3 properties. We'd go to the city commission and basically they adopt a resolution to direct the sale of the property. Again, there's certain things in city ordinance we have to do. And so they give that direction. We had talked to the finance committee about some of the criteria. And so the city commission approves these, you saw that request for proposals and says, here's what we want. So for, one site, we primarily want residential. This site may be more commercial mixed use. And we want something to happen now, not later. And so there was sort of we want you to start within a year. And so there's parameters for the developers. And so when they put together their proposals, they're trying to meet those. They see we want a lot of development, we want it fast, and we'll give incentives, but maybe not minimize that. So then, excuse me. So then we issue those RFPs. We advertise it. There's a lot of the local developers. You just email it out to them so they get that. Try to allow a certain period of time. Some of the developers have been asking about these properties, the old Park East site, for years. We've had to, kind of constantly, when are you gonna do something? When are you gonna do something? And so, we certainly know who's interested. We get the proposals. Because these proposals all needed some sort of incentive, and we've got this committee that's going to be reviewing the incentives later, that seemed to be the logical one committee to look at them because, they're involved with the downtown, they're involved with incentives. And so, rather than have, me just go in and make a recommendation, we had, or the fact we're going to take the high bidder. If we're going to take the high bidder, we wouldn't need a committee. We could just say this is the most money. So these committees looked at, and sometimes that's a trade-off. If you might have a really good development, but the incentive is so great that it's not worth it, we'd rather do this development that's maybe a little smaller, fits in, can get done in a shorter period of time. The other criteria were the experience, financial strength, again, so they can get going. That's where I think authentic housing, there was a big concern with that one. They were incorporated just 30 days ago from today. And so, they haven't done any projects. So, do you go with a new developer, maybe on a small project, but do you really want to try to see if someone can put together a $50 million project, when they haven't done anything before? So that's a factor. So, the committee looked at those criteria, they looked at the incentives, and then they try to come up with a consensus on which proposal is going to be best. So that's why it's so important. I mentioned these water tower sites is, and they probably won't be available for maybe 3 years, but you start to think now, okay, well, what do we want? What's the neighborhood going to be comfortable? Because some of these are going to be more challenging because, you don't want something probably real high density in a single family neighborhood. So you may take less money to get something that fits in. Would you take less money if it's affordable housing? That wasn't our criteria in any of these 3, but it certainly could have been. When we did an RFP, or I believe planning did the RFP on this Milton Earl site, that was, I think, an important part of the the criteria, trying to do some affordable housing on that site. So again, it kind of varies by site. A long answer, but be happy to answer any questions.
So thank you, Jim, for that. That was helpful, the process. So once it gets to the incentive committee, if I heard you right, through all those steps, and I look at sort of the definition of this committee historically, it says, economic incentives and grant funds. So where then, I guess my question is, do we intersect or how? Like, what does that look like?
I mean, I think as far as the low-income housing ones, Milton Earl had that commitment, prior to, I think that commitment from the city prior to, bidding on the land. So, but let me, as far as like the Kmart site, when we were looking at a TIF district down there, this will include low-income housing, the fact that the developer was willing to give the low-income housing developer an option to buy the land for the next year, because that's one of the challenges with getting tax credits is, you apply in August and you don't find out till towards the end of the year. Well, a lot of property owners aren't going to hold the property for you that long. If someone else comes along and wants to buy it, it'll go to that other person. Or so you have to have site control. And so that was a case where, as part of the TIF, they had to give the developer, site control so they could be there. I don't know if the city had already committed some money for the project, but we knew they had a good chance to get low-income housing tax credits just because historically they've been successful, almost at least every other year. They were going to do it in 2 phases. They got fortunate; they got both phases the first year. I was saying, surprised everyone. Is as far as the where we go here with the other projects that we've looked at that don't involve affordable housing. For instance, EPIC, the city commission has selected them. Well, now we have to do a development agreement. We have to see if the Renaissance Zone Authority will give them the 5-year. We've got to plat the property, and so there's a lot of work that happens after you pick, your favorite, before you get to a development agreement, before you actually transfer the property and they can begin construction. So it tends to be a long process.
To answer your question?
Yes, but now I have one more, if I may, Thomas, in terms of all the funding sources, right? So it's interesting that we get to a point where we approve, right? And then sort of see how the finances can fit in, right? Is there more that we can do up front? And I mean, but is that an opportunity? Is that something that we?
I think one of the opportunities might be, for instance, the Burrell site is to plan for in the budget, if it's 2 years from now or 3 years from now, we know there's probably going to be a funding gap. Would we make some home money available for that to be feasible? So if we have, you own the land, so that's a big plus. We probably have TIF money to tear everything down and have a clean site. But there's still going to be a financing gap. And so if there's some block grant money that can come in, the LIHTC funds pay for 75% of it. There's still a gap. You got to borrow some money. You're still going to need some help.
If I may add on to that, so when I think about doing things or following a plan, again, whether it's Sioux Falls or somebody else, or how do we bring these folks to the table together, that might be one way, right? Are there unique funding sources? And so then I think of, well, I need to have a bigger, broader understanding of what sources are currently available now, what structures or other models exist, if that is the role then of the Community Development Committee to weigh in on those things. So I just put that out there for discussion and thoughts.
When I think that too is that's where I think the crux of what do we do as this committee, we in essence kind of backward ourselves into this, okay, we're going to select this group and then we're going to figure out everything afterwards. And again, I'm not saying that there wasn't a process moving forward, but I think is my comments about, how do we develop relationships with companies. I don't know that we're being as proactive as we can to try and actually say, hey, these water tower sites now, again, this is a specific example, are 3 years out. We should probably be talking to somebody now if we really want to see something unique, unless we just are going to go with those that are available, because those are the folks that are probably knowing how to get a hold of Jim, knowing how to scour the city website to say, okay, what's land is for sale. And again, maybe that's the way to do it. I tend to think not, though, and that, again, as we're thinking about how to do really thoughtful, strategic community development, I think that's what I'm hearing you, Jennifer, say is how do we make sure we're being thoughtful of CDBG dollars, making sure that the process is advertised well, making sure that we're not just thinking about, okay, property is going to be sold, okay, done. And again, maybe the mayor knows that, I don't know, maybe the commission knows that, I don't. And I think that's maybe where some of the frustration at the commission is coming from too, is then it's like, well, how have we decided that we're going to do this? And that, then it kind of comes to light, yeah, obviously when it becomes public information, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the research that maybe staff can do is see if the developers would want to be with you. But I think that I'm still a little bit puzzled about Commonwealth Development that has done the Edge Artist Flats. They had an option on the property next door. They were awarded tax credits. This county gave them property tax exemption, and for, I don't know if it was cost or what, but they dropped their option, they gave back the tax credits, and they left town. And, it's a low-income housing group out of Wisconsin. Well, I know they've done some projects elsewhere in the state, but it'd be interesting to meet with them and say, could that project be restructured to better meet where you think the tenants are? But it was disappointing to see, hard to get tax credits turned back, and to see someone drop a project, because we really wanted some more low-income housing downtown. I was kind of excited. We got 2 projects funded. They left town, and Beyond Shelters still hasn't broken ground on theirs. So that was over a year ago.
What I too want to make sure that, again, that I do not want us to get into the operations, either as this ad hoc committee, well, especially not as this ad hoc committee, but as a CD committee, that we don't get into the operations of trying to figure out the nuances of when can you take advantage of property tax or, LIHTC stuff, or what goes into the, that's, again, what you guys know how to do. That's the operations of it. I think we can provide some vision and set some parameters of saying, this is what we would like to see. Now, please, again, go do and operationalize. And that's where it would be fun to think about all of these. But again, I'm a volunteer. And again, I don't want to say that, what we should really do here. And it'd be like, you can't do that. So, hey, no, right? So again, I just want to make sure, again, that as we think about the process, it's how do we have the thoughtful strategic community input, not to ensure that we can, I don't think developers need to come and present to our CD committee. I think it's making sure that planning staff can say, okay, this North Water Tower, nearest school, this is all single-family homes here, save for 2 12-plexes. I'm making this up, right? So what we might want to see in here is a green space. Okay, let's really think then, is there a way we can do that? And then charge the staff, is what you guys do really well, is to then say, okay, so how are we going to work with Fargo Parks or somebody else to develop a green space? Again, example purposes only, but that is what I really hope this committee can get to, versus let's hear from 80 different companies. And again, I almost felt bad for the developers as they came to the CD committee, because I'm like, I don't know, guys, that sounds awesome. They all do, right? And again, I'm not trying to be trite or glib about this, but I think about the amount of time and effort that they all put into those proposals and projects. And then it's like, I don't think you want us reviewing it. Same way that when I think about my own board, right? And that I get to interface with. So probably beating this point longer than it needs to be beaten, but that's what it is.
I hear you saying that you'd like it to be proactive, set the boundaries for it, the expectations, what we could really use there, and then not have to pick out of the list. But as long as it meets this criteria, we have spoken our piece.
And I think to Jennifer, that your points of comments of please talk to us about this process and thinking about what are the criteria. If we can have that set out and set forth in some guiding principles, then it's like, so we're in this neighborhood. we know that this is something that, like, that should almost like trigger, like, this automatic kind of process of saying, ooh, if it's going to be up here, we're going to have to, touch base with CD committee, versus I think where it is now, and I think Commissioner Strand was saying, should CD committee have seen any of these? And again, maybe they should have, but I think as it's laid out here, I don't know that they should have. Because again, these are some pretty comprehensive documents right now, and again, there's a vetting process already, but it's just kind of that, I think John, again, I'm projecting what I think John thought, which I don't know, but that he maybe was thinking that there should be more voice, and always wants to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to weigh in. So, again, my thoughts. But any other business thoughts that we would like to share for the public or for the staff at this point? All right, hearing none, I will just try and recap. Again, we have deferred any action or decision on the actual properties that came in front of the City Commission a couple weeks ago or last week. And what we would like to do then is within 60 days or at the next CD committee meeting, which should be in May, we would hear a historical proposal or some historical models of how CD committee has been structured. That would then give us, as the ad hoc committee, some direction moving forward in developing some bylaws and some vision. Cindy, does that sort of capture your astute notes and points that you've made earlier? Excellent. All right. All right. One thing I do know about Robert's rules is we don't need a motion to adjourn, so unless there's any other business, y'all have a great rest of your day.